let's talk about airspace. This is chapter 9 in your book. Now, airspace is like a big topic. It's kind of confusing. If you're ever out at the airport, BJ has a nice supply of these little guys. So it has typical airspace on one side. On the other side, it has all of the requirements to be in that airspace. So let's start with the most unrestricted airspace. That's Class G. If you take the King schools, ground school, they'll say this stands for go for it. So Class G airspace is airspace where there's not a lot of traffic. In particular, there's not a lot of instrument traffic. So it has very low requirements. You only need 1 mile visibility during the day, and you have to be clear of clouds. You don't have to be a certain distance away from them. You just have to not be in them. Again, if you looked at this little chart, it would tell you this. Now, this is true below 10,000 feet, and above 10,000 feet, it's going to change. And actually, it's going to change above 1,200 feet. But let's be honest, there's not a lot of Class G airspace above 1,200 AGL. So I'm really not going to emphasize that. Here's what you should know. In most cases, Class G airspace ends at 1,200 AGL. Almost always. This is the highest altitude you're going to see it. Now, around some airports, it's going to end at 700 AGL. Bloomsburg is one of those airports, by the way. We haven't talked about charts yet, but you'll see a magenta shaded area around an airport. Usually it's either in the shape of a circle or like a keyhole. So it's very common to see an area looks like this or like this. Sometimes you might have other extensions. Basically, the reason that it looks like this or that is if there's an instrument approach that comes in this way, you might see the keyhole. If there's not, or there's maybe a circling approach or something like that, you might just have a circle around your airport. You can have other shapes, of course, but this is just typical stuff. Okay. So here's why it stops at 700 feet at some airports. The whole reason for the next kind of airspace up the food chain, if you will, which is Class E. Class E is everywhere that's not one of these other airspaces. This is there to keep you VFR guys and gals out of the way. That's the whole reason we have Class E airspace. So if the Class G ends at 700 feet above Bloomsburg, then it goes to Class E. Class E has a different requirement. It's 3 miles visibility, 1,000 above, 500 below, 2,000 to the sides of clouds. Or 3 152s is a nice way to remember that. Okay. what does this mean practically? Here's what this means practically. If I am flying at Bloomsburg and the clouds are below 1,500 feet, I cannot fly my standard 1,000-foot traffic pattern and be legal. If the visibility is below 3 miles, I cannot fly my standard traffic pattern and be legal. If it is 1,000-foot ceiling and I have 1.5 miles visibility, I could legally fly over Bloomsburg if I flew a lower traffic pattern. Don't recommend it, but it'd be legal. Now, here's the point of all this, and Rod mentions this. All these cloud clearance requirements are for one purpose. I got an IFR guy in the cloud. He pops out of the cloud. You don't want him to pop right into you. Right? You want to give each of you a fighting chance to avoid each other. And that's why we have this buffer. So we have 300 feet. You're in your little Piper Cub. You know, the weather's really bad. And here I am in, I don't know, my Malibu. Screaming in 160 knots on my approach. 700 feet in the air, I pop out of a cloud, and then smack. There you go. It's not a good thing. So that's G and E. And E is kind of like a big amorphous blob. It just kind of fills in the gaps between everything that's not one of these other airspaces. We have Class D. We talked about this a little bit in the last chapter. We said Class D is the little airport, something like Williamsport. Typically you have this one little cylinder. It's usually 5 miles statute about, and it's usually 2,500 feet tall, but not always. Class D airport, D stands for dialogue. We already talked about the requirements. Basically, you have to talk to them. You have to establish communications before you get into the Class D. Guess what their visibility requirements are? There you go, 3152. You could look at your little chart, and it's going to say 3152. And that is true until you get to 10,000 feet. So above 10,000 MSL, this goes to 5 and 1,000 above, 1,000 below, and 1 mile to the sides. And why does that happen? Below 10,000 feet, you're limited to a mere 250 knots. Now, there are some exceptions to that. You know, Rod talks about things like if I go into a Class B or C, I go under it, then I'm limited to 200 knots if I'm flying underneath it. Not really a problem for most of us. But up here, people are flying really, really fast, and we need to worry about that a little bit. So that's Class D. Then we have Class C, which again we talked about in the last chapter, where typically you're going to have the 2-layer cake. And this is normally 10 miles, and the little part here is 5 miles, and then there is an uncharted outer area to 20 miles where they provide services. So what are the requirements to be in this? Guess what? 3152. So that's C. B, you've got tons of layers. Typically, this is going to go up to maybe 10,000 feet. Some of them go higher, some of them are lower. The one in Atlanta is higher, the one in New York is lower. It's just the way it is. And, you know, here you've got 3 miles visibility and clear of clouds. And again, I can look at my little chart and it's going to tell me, you know, what are my requirements for that. And again, I would recommend, if you're by the airport, come pick up one of these cards. It can be very handy. Why do I only have to be clear of clouds in the Class B? Well, I'm under positive control. Everyone's on a clearance. So I shouldn't be surprised by somebody popping out of a cloud on me. Controllers are supposed to prevent that from happening. Now, at nighttime, things get a little bit weirder, where at night, you need higher visibilities. So above 1,200 feet, if we go back to the Class G, you have to have a mile visibility, and then you have your 152 for cloud clearances. And at nighttime, it's going to be 3 miles visibility. Now, if you look at things like Class E, at nighttime, you know, things are going to change. And again, you know, Rod says, do you really have to memorize all these? Well, it's not bad if you do, but, you know, do pick up one of these charts and do think a little bit. There are a couple of exceptions, like you can fly at nighttime in a traffic pattern at a field where the visibility is a little bit lower. Is it smart? Well, I don't know. You know, if you're just doing the pattern and you have a couple miles visibility, yeah, it's probably okay. You know, I was just flying yesterday and I think there were a couple of points where it was like maybe a little iffy if we were at our 3 miles visibility. Okay, some other things he talks about. What if you're going into an airport and you don't have this? You don't have your 3 miles visibility and cloud clearances. Then you can ask for what's called special VFR. Some things to know. You can't ask for it at night unless you're instrument rated and you're an instrument equipped aircraft, because it's very easy to wander into a cloud at night. Special VFR, you need to have 1 mile visibility. Clear clouds. Unless you're in a helicopter, then you just have to be clear clouds. It's one of those weird things. Helicopters just don't really fit in very well. The idea of special VFR is that you can get in or out of an area safely. Typically, it's one person at a time for special VFR. They're not going to let everybody get special VFR. I have used this to take off before. I was taxiing out. I was getting ready to go on a long trip, and the visibility dropped from, you know, whatever it was to 2.5 miles or something like that. And they asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like a special VFR for departure. And they gave that to me. I took off. There was like a little bit of a mist. They kind of just suddenly blew through the area. And, you know, I got a couple hundred feet in the air and it was completely clear. And everything was fine. I have had to use special VFR at night to get into an airport. I was doing a flight review with a student in Atlanta. We're coming back and all of a sudden the visibility was way down. Some fog blew in by the airport. And so we had to use a special VFR to land. So how do you get it? You just ask for it. Rod talks a little bit about things like satellite airports. You know, let's say you have an airport that's untowered and it's inside of the Class D airspace, you take off, you contact the controllers as soon as you can, as soon as practical. Same thing if it's Class C, Class B, it's all the same. I didn't really mention it. Class A starts at 18,000, and that's where we go to flight levels. We set our altimeter, 29.92 inches of mercury in the Colsman window. And then we say flight level 180, flight level 250, which means 25,000 feet, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all IFR up there. By the way, that only goes up to 60,000 feet, and then it goes VFR again. So the airspace above 60,000 feet is not controlled. So if you're a U-2 spy plane, you can climb up through the Class A and be VFR. I guess that's really VFR on top. That's something we talk about as instrument pilots, but definitely something you have. He does talk a little bit about equipment requirements. If you're going to fly into Class B or C, you need to have a radio, obviously, and you need to have a transponder with mode C. Now, something he doesn't mention here that's new as of January 1st this year is you also have to have ADS-B out. So that is automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. And basically, this is a system where your aircraft will send out a signal saying, I'm at this altitude, this speed, here's my tail number, here's what I got going on. And this helps ATC where there's bad radar coverage. This was originally developed in Alaska. Alaska, they have more planes than cars up there. And so they developed this new system. It's part of something called free flight, where the idea is eventually aircraft will negotiate with each other if there's conflicts and things like that, especially if you're outside of radar coverage. So that's something that you have to fly into a Class C or B. So if you look at our club trainer here, you'll see there's a little placard on the nav lights that say they have to be on in order to have ADS-B out. So because we got that, you can fly to Allentown or down toward Philly if you really want to. He does mention that some of the Class Bs have VFR corridors. And if you are going to fly in some of these areas, you probably need to get a terminal area chart. I know we haven't talked about charts yet, but we will. And that will show you what the region is. There's some flyways that are common ways that people will avoid the Class B. So when I was down in Atlanta, I would often have people come, and sometimes they were pilots from outside the area, and they would come to me and say, hey, Phil, I want to learn how to get around this Class B. And I would show them, okay, you can fly from here to this landmark and stay below this altitude and you'll be fine. Sometimes they actually carve out parts of the Class Bravo. For example, if you go to New York and you want to fly down the Hudson River, they have the Hudson River exclusion, and it has some special flight rules for how to fly it. So that's something that I actually did somewhat recently. It's a little bit of fun. So there are things like that you'll find. Rod talks about special use airspace. We have prohibited areas. That means don't go there. Restricted areas means you can only go there if you have permission from a controlling agency. Who's the controlling agency? Good question. If you have a paper chart, you can look on the paper chart. It'll tell you if it is a electronic chart. You can look in the digital chart supplement. It will also tell you. If you really don't know, you could call up flight service or some local ATC folks and say, you know, who's in charge of that? They have warning areas. Warning areas are basically restricted areas, but they're in places that they can't restrict, like outside of the U.S. continental limits. They'll just warn you, hey, there's a lot of activity out here, but you know, we can't control it because it's outside of our airspace. We have alert areas just telling you, hey, by the way, there's a lot of flight training here. Just be aware. Military operation areas, or MOAs. These are places where the military will do different training missions. As a VFR-only pilot, you can fly right through them, and they're supposed to avoid you, but you can talk to ATC, and they can tell you if they're active or not. Again, if you look at the chart or chart supplement, it should be able to tell you if they have standard hours that they operate. You know, some of them are only activated by NOTAM, some of them are always active. It is not uncommon to see something like a restricted space in the middle of a MOA. And the reason for that is, you know, you might have this general bigger area where they do stuff, and maybe they want to do some dogfighting or something really dangerous. So they want to restrict that airspace. So you're not just flying through and, you know, here comes a fighter Mach 1.5 and bam, right into you. That would be bad. They also have military training routes, and these will be depicted on charts. They have VFR routes that start with VR, IFR routes start with IR. If they have a 4-digit number, they are below 1500 AGL that they fly these routes. If they have a 3-digit number, it's above 1500 AGL. Other things that are important to know about temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs. You know, after September 11th, they actually had TFRs over DC. They were temporarily there for years, and now they have a bunch of new rules for flying in that area. Speaking of which, I strongly recommend, if you're flying in this area, you can go online and you can take a class on the DC Special Rules Flight Area. So why would you want to do that? Well, legally, if you're close enough to DC, you have to have taken that training. You'll get a certificate. You also get a wallet-sized certificate you can print out and take with you, so that if you're ever down that way and someone asks, you can produce it and say, I've been trained in how to enter and exit this airspace. It's not a big deal, but definitely something you want to do. I actually had a student who wasn't my student who came to me a while ago, and he said, hey, I want to do a mock check ride with you. And I said, great. He said, why don't you start by planning me a trip from here to Manassas? And they were really proud of themselves because they managed to avoid the dullest airspace. And I asked them if there was any other special considerations for their trip, and they said no, right? Because they didn't know about those special rules. So you go to FAAsafety.gov, you can take the class, you can get your certificate, and then you'll know what to do. So, student pilot probably shouldn't be flying down there, but anyways, definitely something I would recommend that you do. A couple of post-flight briefings he has. One of them in particular, I've had some students tell me that they found this depiction very useful. This is post-flight briefing 2, where he has this little pyramid. Let's see if I can get this. And here we have E and G. We have G and G, B, C, D, E. All right. So this is 10,000 MSL. And here during the daytime, if we're below 1200 AGL, it's 1 mile clear of clouds. And then here we have a little cloud. 3 miles visibility for BCDE, 1 mile visibility here, and then it's 2,000 to the side, 1,000 above, 500 below. And if it's nighttime, then your G becomes BCDE requirements, and above 10,000 feet, it's going to be 5 miles, 1K, 1K, and 1 mile to the side. So if that helps you to remember these cloud clearances better, hey, go for it. Okay. I've had a couple of people tell me that they found this easier to understand, so if that's you, use it. You know, if it doesn't help you, well, then don't use it. All right, so that brings us to the end of chapter 9, which is all about airspace.